Hi everyone, it's Kat from Calico Cali Designs. Today's tutorial has nothing to do with embroidery and in fact is all about paper piecing. I'm recording this tutorial for my friends at the Common Threads quilting group. But if you're not a member, you can still watch and learn. So as you guys know, this year's big charity quilt is going to be a paper pieced quilt. This tutorial is basically the same demonstration that I did in our March meeting, so you can follow along with the printed instructions that I handed out, or just feel free to watch as many times as you want. This unfinished quilt here next to me was done entirely by paper piecing. Paper piecing is very accurate. I think it's fun. It goes along really fast once you get going, and as you can see, the results are just amazing. I think our charity quilt is going to be really spectacular. So let's head on over to the sewing machine and I'll show you how it's done. Alright, so a couple of things before we begin. Here's the pattern that we're going to use for our demo, and here's what it's going to look like when it's finished. So remember that you're going to put your fabric on the blank side of the paper, and you're going to actually sew on the printed side of the paper. So the wrong side of your fabric should be touching the blank side of the paper. What I like to do to make it easier for myself is to mark the pattern with the color fabric that I'm going to use. Each section is a different piece of fabric. So my middle will be red and my two sides are going to be blue. You're going to cut your pieces of fabric. They can be bigger than the actual space. Super big, doesn't matter. We're going to trim everything up later. And remember to change the stitch length on your machine to 1.5 stitches. That's 15 stitches per inch. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin my number one fabric, which is my red, to this piece here. Alternatively, you could use a glue stick and glue stick it down. I just prefer a pin. So here comes the fun part. Obviously I have all this extra fabric. I need to know where to place my blue piece of fabric in my number 2 section before I can stitch it down. So here's how we're going to do that. This will be the line that we stitch on, and we want to have a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to place my ruler here so that I have a 1/4 inch, and I'm going to fold the paper along that 1/4 inch line. I'm going to give it a good crease. Now I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm just going to cut right along here, being careful not to cut the actual paper. Okay, so I folded my paper, and actually I'm going to place my ruler just a smidgen over the paper so I don't cut it. Rotary cutter, just going to cut away that extra fabric. I don't need it, just toss it aside. So now, when we flip this over, this is the edge that we're going to place our next piece of fabric against. So it would be right sides together, and we're going to line it up just along there. Flip it back over. We're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch along this line. Okay, so I'm at my sewing machine. I have changed my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters. That's 15 stitches per inch. And one thing to note is that on this particular block, this gray area all the way around is our 1/4 inch seam. That's when we're sewing multiple blocks together, or if you're going to stitch a border on there. So in this case, it's okay to start in that gray area and to end in the gray area, because those extra stitches would be covered up with the seam allowance. So here we go, we're just going to stitch right on the line. I went a little bit into that seam allowance. Okay, so now that it's sewn, the next thing we're going to do is pull our blue fabric down and use our handy dandy pressing sticks to go ahead and press the seam. If you wanted to, you could take this to an iron and press it with an iron. You want to make sure that obviously you press on the fabric side and not on the paper side. And if you're using an iron, make sure it's dry. You don't want to use steam with the paper attached. So now we're going to repeat the same exact steps for the other side. So I'm going to spin this around. The line that you're stitching on is always going to be the line that's in between the number that you're working on and the next lowest number. So in this case, we're going to work on number 3. The next lowest number here is number 1, because number 2 is way over here and we already stitched that line. So obviously this is the line that we're going to sew on next. So again, I'm going to take my ruler, put it on the 1/4 inch line, fold my paper, crease it over, take my rotary cutter, and I'm going to cut off the extra fabric, being careful not to cut the paper. Right across, toss that aside. There we go. And now my next piece of fabric is going to line up right along that cut edge. And I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to stitch along this line here. Okay, once again, I have my stitch length shortened to 1.5 millimeter. I'm going to start a little bit before the line, so I'm actually in this gray seam allowance area. I'm going to stitch right on the line down through to the other gray area. Done. Now it looks like this. Go back to my cutting board and we will press it. Okay, I'm back at my cutting board. I'm going to flip up the blue fabric, use my handy dandy pressing stick, and press my seam down. So now at this point you're going, great, you sewed it, but it looks icky. You're going to remove the pin, flip it over, and now we're simply going to trim away just alongside the outside edge of the gray seam allowance. And then we'll have our finished block. And this will, because you're trimming paper, dull your rotary cutter a little bit faster than normal. So kind of keep that in mind. Alright, there we go. And now, voila! Our perfectly paper pieced flying geese. At this point you would leave the paper attached so that you could sew multiple flying geese together, multiple blocks together. Or if you wanted to add a border, you could add a border. So to sew them together, you would decide, which way you wanted them to go, like this, or however your pattern indicates. And you would line up the edges and sew on this solid line here. And that would give you your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that was done, then you could go ahead and remove the paper. So a trick for pulling the paper off is to pull on the fabric from corner to corner, and sometimes that helps make it easier to remove. Sometimes it doesn't. So if it doesn't, you can just gently rip it along the perforated edges. I kind of like to hold on to the seams so we don't accidentally rip any stitches out. There we go, all finished.